It's really a pleasure to have you all join us for this conversation. We're going to be talking about how to leverage implementation research for equity in global health. And just to give some perspective, this session has been organized by the UAB, University of Alabama at Birmingham Spackman Center for Global Health that I have the privilege of directing. And I'm going to skip, the question really is, what is implementation research and why is implementation research important for equity? Implementation research, simply defined, is really the study of implementation, as simple as that. That is to put emphasis on how to do intervention and on why intervention achieve their outcome, as opposed to trying to understand the what and establishing efficacy for an intervention. So oftentimes when we do our study, we are focusing on what works. But implementation forces the focus away or shifts the focus away from what works to how and why what works. And I think it's really important because for a number of reasons we know what works for different kind of health conditions in different contexts. But the problem is, or the challenge is how to translate what works even to impact, how to do what works. So for instance, we know that vaccine works to prevent a lot of infectious diseases. But there are concerns about how do you implement effectively a vaccines program. So our challenge is not much of what works, is really how to do what works. And that's really what implementation science to try to address. And another reason why implementation research is important is really because of the lag between what we know works and is scalable and when that is actually disseminated and used in a way that it maximizes its impact. So the case we are trying to make here is that implementation research is really very important to address this lag between what we know to do and doing what we should do to achieve maximum health impact. And again, global health particularly presents a diversified context. That is to say that we have practitioners, different kinds of actors, practitioners, researchers, policymakers, working within the field of global health. We have different topics, from clinical related matters to public related matters. We have different contexts, different environments, different processes, different culture that are encompassed within global health. And therefore, the study of implementation in different contexts becomes very important for the achievement of the aspirations of global health. So, implementation research is important, and implementation research focuses on the science of implementation. So the next, really, just to give some context to the reason for this session, is that why should we therefore be talking about implementation research for health equity, or health for addressing health inequity? Health inequity, simply put, unfair, unjust health differences among population groups. We know that even though over the years we've made some gains in health improvement, but inequity gaps persist within countries and among countries. And therefore, if we are not intentional to implement, to address inequity, we really are not going to be able to maximize the impact that most of the intervention promises to deliver. And then secondly, every time that we go into a system to implement something, whether we are practitioners, as a researcher, as academics, as policymakers, we are interrogating the system. And for better or for worse, we are shifting the inequity gaps even within those systems, because power is always encountered whenever we implement. And we are perturbing the asymmetries within power, whether as a researcher, as a practitioner. So whether even if you didn't go into the system with the intention of addressing inequity, your implementation is going to either worsen or ameliorate inequity gaps. So therefore, we really have to be intentional in how we implement in order to address inequity gaps. So today, we really are going to be talking about all of these. Our objective today is really to present what implementation research is, to also present what are inequities and what are the different forms of inequities, particularly in global health, and to make the connection between implementation research and health inequities, and perhaps provide some strategies to do that. But I will be remiss if I really do not acknowledge the current global health landscape and what we are contending with, even as we speak. So lastly, we're going to really be focusing on how can implementation research help us to respond to the challenges that are confronting all of us within the current global health landscape. So without any further ado, I would introduce myself, and I would also introduce our panelists that are with us today. I'm Kunle Alonge, and I'm from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And then I have with me today, from my left to my right, Yodi Mandedrata, who is from the University of Gadjah Mada University, from all the way from Yogyakarta in Indonesia. I think he almost flew over 24 hours to get to Atlanta. And then in the middle, I have Malabika Saka. She didn't fly too far. She came from Brown University. And then to my extreme left, I have David Peters, who came all the way from Canada. York University, Canada. So I'm going to invite each of them to give their opening remarks, particularly reflecting on what implementation research is, how can we use implementation research to address inequities in global health, and to also reflect a little bit on what does it mean, what does all of this mean for the current landscape of global health, the forces that are confronting all of us. How do we use implementation research to address that? Yodi, you have the floor.
Thank you, Kunle. Good morning, everyone. So let me start with a disclaimer. I'm probably the only one up here who's not an expert on equity. In fact, I was reminded how ignorant I was of equity a few years ago during the pandemic. So let me start with that. Let me take you to Indonesia, April 2020. Just about 1 month after the first case of COVID-19 was declared officially by our president. So around that time, I was contacted by a high-level government official saying, Dr. Yodi, can you join a Zoom meeting in the afternoon? We need your advice. I said, yes, sure, fine. So I went on Zoom. There were 6 ministers online. That was quite intimidating. I usually only talk to 1 minister. This was 6. And they were very direct. Dr. Yodi, welcome. We need your advice. Should we lock down the capital, Jakarta, or not? Wow, that's a $1 billion question. I didn't have the answer, so I tried to get my way out of that. So I said, I don't have a ready answer. Give me a few days, I'll come back to you. I don't even know what I'm going to do in a few days. But I went back to my colleagues and we said, okay, let's do a quick and dirty mathematical modeling. So I worked with Donnie, who's here also, another colleague, and we came up with a quick mathematical modeling showing them different scenarios. What happens if you do a lockdown? What happens if you don't do a lockdown? What happens in betweens? They seemed to be happy with it. So they took it to the president. And then they come back to us and said, Dr. Yodi, we appreciate your team's model, but sorry, we cannot use this to make decisions. It's like, okay, what's wrong? And then they say, well, it doesn't tell us much in terms of the social economic impact. About 70% of the labor force in Indonesia is in the informal sector. So these are people who are not living on a monthly salary. These are people who are living on a daily basis that they have to go out there every day, sell food, drive taxi, drive pedicabs, if you tell these people to stay home for months, who's going to take care of them? So it's an equity consideration, equity concerns. It was like a slap on the face, because I was a professor in health policy and management. I forgot the equity issue at all. So that was a reminder. Now, having that as a lesson, we embarked on several research on equity of pandemic responses across Asian countries. So we joined the consortium, and there were several papers which came out of this consortium. I'm just going to share a couple. This one, for example, on public health and social measure for pandemic response, in which we documented that there were a wide variety of interventions across Asian countries, but in general, they fall into one of these objectives, be it to curb onward transmission, reduce mortality, or preserve livelihood. But we also document that there were a lot of unintended consequences with these interventions. So we saw there were widening income gaps in several contexts. We saw there were some increased gender-based violence in some settings. We saw there were lowered educational attainment in some contexts. We saw there were lowered other social and health indices. So basically inequities caused by the interventions. So we went further to try to seek the roots of this, and this was another paper which we came out with, which document the different type of vulnerabilities in the context of the pandemic response. So there we categorize it into 5. The first is health vulnerability. So there are, among the populations, people who are chronically sick, terminally ill. So they are in higher risk of severe symptoms or complication, and they have lack of access to health services. You also have people who are economically vulnerable. So either they have adverse economic or employment condition, either unemployed, partially employed, self-employed, or informal sector. You also have people who have low income. You also have people with lack of digital access, access to internet, access to computers, and so forth. And then you also have socially vulnerable population, those who are exposed to poor quality housing, overcrowded, those are socially isolated, and those are who are vulnerable to violence. And then you have institutional vulnerability, so prisoners, for example, institutionalized persons, mentally challenged populations, and also children. And then you have cognitive or communicative vulnerability, so children, migrant population, those struggling with communication, to poor mental health condition, and so forth. Now we have another paper which tries to then present what are the options to actually address these vulnerabilities, but I'm not going to go there. I'm trying to link to the IR, which Kunle alluded to. So how can IR actually address this? There are different ways that we can think of. So in IR, for example, we put a lot of emphasis on engagement, stakeholder engagement. So with that, the engagement is as important as the method in IR. So with that, when we do IR, we need to think of who are the key stakeholders among the vulnerable populations, what are their preferences, what are their priorities, and so forth. And then also in IR, we consider which interventions we need to implement or de-implement. And for that, we could also have equity consideration. So we can think of, is the interventions actually have strong potential to control disease among the vulnerable population? We can think of whether it's actually a priority to vulnerable population. We can think of other interventions which are actually low value and we need to de-implement among vulnerable population. And then also in IR, we are very much focused on outcomes, be it impacts or implementation outcomes. So we could think of assessing what are the impact gaps among the vulnerable population, what are the implementation outcome gaps among vulnerable populations. And last but not least, in IR, we think of implementation strategies. So we can think of which implementation strategies could overcome the barriers and optimize the reach among vulnerable population. And we could also think what measures will allow us to ensure that our strategies actually improve not worsen, health disparities among vulnerable population. And there are still much more we can think of in terms of IR for equity, but I will leave that to the discussion in the interest of time. But just to end with a thought that these are all great. IR certainly have a lot of potentials, but to be frank, this is not the way we've been training IR. We've been training IR in our institution for over a decade. We've been involved in other institutions across Asia. And many of these trainings are technically focused on how to ensure the successful technical implementation. Equity is somewhat on the back seat. Yeah? So in our MPH course, we teach IR, and we have also equity courses, but these are disconnected, so we don't link them. So this would call for a rethink on how we actually deliver training on IR, and even further, we could rethink how IR is actually conceptualized, the current theories, frameworks, tools, measures that it would be able to contribute more to equity. So I would just leave you with that thought. Thank you for your attention.
And next we have Malabika Saka.
Good morning, everybody. So today's presentation, what I'm presenting today is the kind of my experience, 35 years in public health and 10 years as an implementer and 25 years as an academic. So I bridge my experience as a grassroots implementer in Bangladesh and later as an academic. So the unique challenge is to address the equities. The first challenge is the identifying and prioritizing the target population. So what we have to do that we need to gather data. We need to do the root cause analysis, looking at the social determinants. We need to find out the intersectionality, because sometimes we have this silo definition of vulnerable population. They're like women, and then poor, the children, HIV positive, or that living in humanitarian settings. So we need to prioritize the intersectionalities and identify who are the most vulnerable. And finally, the community engagement. I'll keep talking about the community engagement because that's very close to my heart, and I do think that's the foundation or backbone for a sustainable global health to ensure global health equity. Second is we need to address the structural barrier. These are the 4A, all of us know: availability, accessibility, affordability, and acceptability. The finally is the building trust in marginalized community for sustainability. And for that, we need to invest in the local institution. We need to train our staff, particularly the frontline worker, for the continuity. We need to diverse or mobilize the domestic resource. Finally, the most important thing that we need to develop a skill and expand our language and the cultural sensitivity, which most often the lacking. The language is very important, not as a language like, I speak Bangla, but I know that my Bangla is not understandable for many communities, even in Bangladesh. They have their own local language, that local vocabulary. Same thing with the global health. Our equity, you'll find the division we have now, most of our community, they don't understand this intellectual word, that equity, or what does it mean global health? Global health is only for the poor countries, which is not necessarily true. So finally, we have to invest for the scalability and sustainability. I just want to finish because with a statement that when we speak about the vulnerable population, we often forget that there's a vulnerable population who are frontline health workers, or community health workers. I have witnessed there are gender-based violence against them in the community. They are not paid or very low paid. They have immense work in addition to their household work, and also sometimes the discrimination. So I want to kind of address that when we think about the equity, not only focus on the vulnerable population who are our community or beneficiaries, but also to include our frontline health worker or community health worker. Thank you.
And then David Peters.
Thank you, and it's really a privilege and opportunity to be part of this panel, and nice to be back in the United States. Coming from up north, I have to acknowledge and thank your dear leader for the offer to become the 51st state. I think it does represent the kind of interdependence of our economies and of our societies. But and we're happy to share some of those precious minerals too. If you've seen what's happened this last week, if we were to do so, we would no longer have a Canada-U.S. hockey rivalry, and that just would cut too much to our national identity. So we'll just have to gratefully decline. But I do want to say that, start off from looking at this notion that, on this notion that we are privileged. The fact that we're in academia, we are privileged. If you're in academia working in another country, you are especially privileged. But we do have a problem with legitimacy. And that is, because in many cases we have acted as though the expertise and moral authority really lies within educated elites, and really not done enough to recognize that the intended beneficiaries have capabilities and interests and ways of knowing that has been underrepresented in how we work. And now we're at a time where this power or resources in academia is under threat. It is being reduced by other forces. Certainly in the U.S. regime, is taking away some of that power, and that has implications. Certainly there is an anti-intellectual opposition to universities and to global cooperation that I think is in part a response to that. The regime itself looks a lot like a kakistocracy, a rule by the most unscrupulous and least qualified to lead, but they do have a mandate, and we have to recognize that mandate includes many people that are underrepresented and actually the intended beneficiaries of equity. And so we must, move forward with that kind of recognition. So I think that one of the questions is, how can we become part of a solution to contribute to global health equity? And part of this is recognizing some of the privileges we've had, and that including academic structures and really a whole dominant way of thinking that is not necessarily held by many other parts of society. And in my own university, I would have to recognize that we are physically based on the lands that is the traditional and current home of many indigenous peoples, including Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. But we do need to move beyond just recognition of this, but try to understand the ways in which we can actually move forward. And I would say that part of this is doing so in different ways. And education has to be a big part of that. I think that we've heard a lot about exchanges, but I would challenge us to look at new ways in which we can collaborate on education as really changing the game for individuals, families, but also for other populations and nations in terms of working towards the common good. And many of you will have experiences in terms of how this has worked. In my own family, my grandparents and my wife's parents came to Canada as refugees, and it was education that really provided the opportunity to thrive in life. So I'm sure there are many stories of this among you, but this is really a big part of the opportunity and power that we have. I would also say that we need to be humble. Humility is not a weakness. We need to be humble in very almost aggressive type of ways with a quest for being able to learn from each others in participative ways. We have a common purpose, or many common purposes, and we need to respect those. Yes, these are some useful framings of equity. We do a lot in terms of framing and theories and methods and approaches, and that's all part of it, but it is all part of how do we move forward with a kind of humility. Part of that is including many voices that have not been at the table with very different ways of thinking. As well as acting. And that has, of course, very different ways of how we look at equity and equity for whom or for what. But now I am switching to implementation research. So part of this about implementation is how do you generate and use knowledge? Now Gandhi was a prime example of how you speak truth to power. Below you see a small example of showing truth to power and showing in a certain country where Gandhi was most powerful, actually, is showing that most of the subsidies were going to the public subsidies were going to the richest quintile rather than the poorest quintile. So that became a call to action. It also helps to inform policies. Occasionally, you are lucky that the research that we do can help identify feasible solutions and how they work. And this is an example in the former Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Again, have to be humble for other reasons because these of larger forces, but they do show the implementation research in terms of how to inform policy. Innovation is critical, often coming up from the bottom, issues about how do we actually gather those innovations and spread them, and now in a time of necessity and extreme volatility, that's a time to innovate as well. And then more commonly, such as Quinley raised, this is about implementation and the research. How do we take from what we know or what we think we should know to actually doing it? So let me finish, if I can get to the last slide, and saying that that we really need to recognize and take advantage of our internet connectivity, that we have an unrelenting call to action, and I'm framing this in my own way. Others will frame it in different ways, that we do need to continually find ways of incorporating our equity, justice, self-determination values that we hold dear in order to be able to serve the world around us and humanity. And that, I think, is the big call to action and the opportunity with global health, but also with implementation research in that space. So thank you.
Thank you. So a big thank you to our panelists. So we're going to move on to the second segment of the plenary session, which is our discussion. And the discussion has been formatted in a very interesting way because we really want to give as many voices the opportunity to speak to some of this conversation. So we have faced the discussion into two parts. So we're going to have a closed discussion where we would be discussing with the panelists in terms of specific questions that have been pre-formatted. And then that would take us to the second set of the discussion, which is really going to be open to the audience. And you will see cards that have been placed on your seats. So if you look at your seats, this is almost like you're in church, right? And you have to give an offering. So there's a card that is placed on your seat, and the card is really to collect your comments and your question. So I'm going to invite my colleague, Dr. Anna Elova, if you don't mind just showing. So Dr. Anna Elova is going to be coordinating the floor. So what that means is that if you have any comments, if you have any question regarding to what has been presented or regarding implementation research, or in fact you just want to vent about some of the things that have been happening, you can just fill that in, and we're asking you to provide. If you don't have to put your name down, you don't have to put your affiliation down if you are not so inclined, but we would love to collect all that information. And then for full disclosure, this information is going to be synthesized, and we are going to look for opportunities to publish them in different platforms so that this voice that we are amplifying here can actually be disseminated even across the world, and people can hear why global health is important, where issues of inequities are important. So again, the information, just prepare your comment and your question. When it's time for us to do the open discussion, we will have opportunity to invite some of the people who are asking questions to the microphone so that you can even provide elaboration to your question. Do we get that? Yes, is it clear? Good, good, good. So, so I'm going to sit here. I think I should sit.
Yeah.
Let me see. Let me not just stand on. Yeah, let me be comfortable too. So I think Yodi, Malabika, and David, they've done an excellent job just to give a purview of what implementation research is, what health inequities are, what are some of the different forms of inequity, like we heard from both Yodi and David, and what are different strategies and principles for addressing health inequities in global health, like we heard from Malabika and David. And but there are other issues that are really confronting us as we speak. The global health as we know it, we are being challenged and questions have been raised by external forces on what global health is, what global health is not. And really my first question, which is going to go to Yodi, is really around this whole notion that are the aspirations of global health. And when I say global health, I'm referring to public health for the common good. I'm talking about an area of study, practice, research that is really espousing health for everyone. I mean, like Malabika said, not just looking at it from an high-income country or low- and middle-income country perspective, but trying to address the health needs of vulnerable population in resource-limited settings, which abounds everywhere. Okay, so are those aspirations, are they still relevant and attainable in 2025 and moving forward? Reflecting on all of the things that have been happening leading up to now, decolonizing global health, and in more recent times, issues around isolationism, national interest, self-interest, me first, this country first, and so on. Are those aspirations still attainable? And what does they mean? What do they mean for global health? Please.
Okay. Thank you, Kunle. So there's a short answer, there's a long answer to that. The short answer is absolutely, they're still relevant. The long answer is, yes, the mission of global health, improving global health equity is not just relevant, but increasing even more relevant nowadays. The event of the pandemic highlighted our collective vulnerabilities, and it proved that disease does not respect borders. So the pandemic affirms the pursuit of health equity is not just aspiration, it's a necessity. But we must also acknowledge that global health keeps failing on equity again and again and again, also during the pandemic. It keeps failing mainly because the field itself is inequitable. It's dominated by actors in high-income countries, and global health itself, historically, it has a deep contradiction. It's birthed through colonial legacy, but its mission is to reduce inequities nowadays. So today, more than ever, we really need to reconfigure global health, refine our strategies, and redouble our efforts rather than abandon the aspiration or the ideals.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Yodi. So yes, the aspiration of global health are still relevant and they're still attainable, but we still have a long way to go. And my question, I'm going to ask Malabika the same question, and with an emphasis on how do we then reconfigure global health in now, given all of the challenges that we are facing, how do we reconfigure global health in order to respond to these challenges and then yet fulfill those aspirations? And if you want to reflect also on the original part of the question, please do so as well.
Thank you, Kunle. To me, currently the global health problem, actually two problems. So far, my experience, that one is that disinformation. I think if we are together, we can tackle with climate change or antimicrobial resistance, but this disinformation, which is global. Even a rural Bangladeshi in a rural district have access to Facebook. So we have this Facebook Society and WhatsApp University, which is really, really, I would say that damaging. The second one is also very global. Even go to rural India or rural Uganda, commercialization of health. So I do think that other disease or infection, it's not difficult because we do have our skill and if we are together, but these two we need to deal with that, and these are the two global health crises. And it also affects everybody. It's not the poor, family in Nairobi slum. It's the richest boy in the Gulshan, the most posh area in Bangladesh. So these two is not affected, so that the definition of the vulnerability need to be changed. It's not the only rich people that are not vulnerable. There is the disinformation affects mostly all of us. Even there's one of my relative who is highly educated in the USA and Bangladeshi relative, and he told me, I was surprised that so much money we're giving through USAID. And I said, it's also going to your own country. He said, but no, if I don't have any food in the fridge, am I going to distribute food to my neighbor? So you see that, and that's where we fail. You go to a rural area, you will find the Coca-Cola or the shampoo, but not the eating carrot is good. So there's a huge, I would say that we fail to communicate, and US is the last victim of failure to communicate with the general people. So we need to build our communication skill, and the way we can tackle the global health crisis is through communicating, and that have to be from the policymakers to implementer to community health work and researcher. And with due respect, all of the researcher, we have this crown in our head, as in living in ivory tower. We need to, that what Peter said, that be humble. And it's very important to, again, that developing the communication skill, that how can we communicate. So I will stop here and maybe we'll come back later.
Yes, thanks a lot, Malabika. I know there's quite a lot to say, and I'm going to turn to David now, particularly because I think Canada is really one of the few places where they are feeling the very impact of the isolation, the self-interest and national interest in the U.S. And I really want him to really reflect on these. I think you touched upon the issues around decolonizing global health in your presentation, and you also touched upon some of the issues around self-interest and how that is impacting on solidarity to the public health. Still the same question. So how do you tackle these forces? How do you tackle these forces in a way that global health still accomplishes its aspirations?
Well, thanks. I think that, first of all, I'm not going to disagree with Yodi or Malavika. I think that that's what they've indicated is part of the answer. I don't think that we ever achieve those goals ultimately, but we do have these, what brings global health together really is the values and goals around trying to address inequities and seek justice through the tools that we have. But I do think that that we're going to have to learn how to do things differently, because it's not that simple when we talk about how global health is configured. Well, it really was, I think Kent Busey used to call it an unruly melange of actors. But now we're going to be suddenly having, the U.S. take out $12 billion in global health. That's going to dramatically change the landscape. Nobody is within an order of magnitude of that kind of funding. So that does mean that we're going to have to rely on our creativity and innovation, and perhaps have a chance to learn from the bottom up and learn how to collaborate and share information differently. Yes, we have the new challenges of disinformation. But so part of this is, so I don't have an answer, but I think the pathways will involve how do we build trust, and building trust not just with universities and academia, but with with the information that we bring to how we ourselves act and others act. And that does mean engagement, engaging in a different way, whether it's, and there's going to be a diversity of views and approaches to do that. But I do think that we're at a time where we have to take the opportunity to not fold in the face of the volatility, but really to create new ways of coming together, to speak with one voice, but with many, but recognizing that there really is diversity in those voices. We don't want to come together as if it's just groupthink and that we're protecting our own. We need to come in with this really kind of ambitious humility, I would say, that we go down this journey of learning together with this stubbornness towards those why we came together in the first place, which was about making life better for humanity.
Yeah. Thank you. Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Dave.
Yeah. Now, just to add to them, part of the possible answer as well, it's power shift. I mean, the pandemic should have been enough as a wake-up call that South countries, low middle-income countries, cannot rely or dependent on foreign aids on high-income countries, and it's actually happening. I mean, for example, my own country, Indonesia, was the first middle-income country to take the G20 presidency, and then after it was taken up by India, after it was taken up by Brazil, and in these countries, for example, because of the realization during the pandemic, now we're talking about increasing our capacity to develop our own vaccines, building our capacity so that we're not relying on the high-income countries for vaccines, drugs, and other technologies. And also talking more about if it's not possible within the country, you have a regional or south-to-south mechanism for that. So I think that that's part of the thing that needs to be advanced. But of course, it's not easy. You would also need allyship. You need also some assistance from the global north, at least, to challenge the inequitable system. I mean, for example, reforming travel and visa requirements, and also many other things. I mean, just also we should walk the talk as universities and also this consortium. There are practices within our universities which actually contribute to these inequities as well. There are also practices within consortium which contribute to inequity as well. When just an example, I mean, having global health conferences in high-income countries all the time. So yes. So I'm happy to hear. I just heard during the breakfast that somewhere in the future, the CUGH conference will be hosted outside the US. So that's a good news. Hopefully it will be in low middle income countries. Hopefully it will be rotated. So then we can actually show the way, take the lead by example. Thank you, Kunle.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Yodi, and to David and Malabika as well. And I think it's interesting that David did allude to the point that the funding gaps is going to come from somewhere, and we need to be creative, given what the recent development in global health has been. And it's interesting that Yodi, you responded, yes, as somebody speaking from the Global South do have what it takes to step up to the plate and fill this funding gap. I think that's really, really interesting perspective. I'm going to switch the question a little bit now. I mean, to leveraging some of the things David has said about speaking with one voice, that we need to speak with one voice, and our voice needs to be cohesive. And how can you speak with one voice when the language that you use is contested? So let's take, for instance, issues around equity. I mean, what equity means for one might be different from what equity means for another. So particularly, I'm focusing on equity and health inequities, and I'm like asking why is such contestation around those terms? And I'm going to reflect this I'm going to turn this to Malabika. And how do we address this? Because without cohesion in our voice, in our language, we cannot amplify our voice. We need to agree on what we are talking about, and we need to find a way forward. So why terms like equity contested, and how do you address those contestations with the view of moving forward, particularly for achieving sustainable impact on health inequities?
I think we need to change, particularly this high-income country, low-income country. It needs to be changed to high-income, resource poor and resource-rich setting. Because look at Ambani's son's wedding in India. So like that, if you think about enormous wealth, some of the so-called low-income country, even Bangladesh has, even in Dhaka, is unbelievable. And whereas if you come to rural Mississippi or rural Alabama, or immigrants in Germany or UK, there's not much difference in the health that in the poor countries. So that's the language. If we use, I think that will remove the division between that, because then somebody in Mississippi is also think that, okay, global health is not about only the poor people in Ghana or Chad or Nigeria or Bangladesh, it's also about us. So that's, I think it's very important to change the language. Second is that's why I like the implementation research that David also says that can't emphasize on the community engagement, bringing community capacity building of the local institute, because if we want to bring them on board, and that's what implementation research does, it's not the research again in ivory tower. We have to engage with the policymakers, the implementers, and even the community, even to formulate a research question. The methodology is so much flexible. So I do think that's changing the language and more communication. I can't, press enough about the communication skill, not only writing paper to Lancet, sorry, Joey, that are in New England Medicine. We need to more publication in local language, in local, the publication. And also we need to change these indicators for being an academic. I think we should include as an indicator how many we wrote blog or op-ed or translated in local language or policy brief or have a discussion, 2 minutes video for the Ministry of Health. That should be included in the academic performance. And that will, reduce the gap between the researcher and the policymakers and the implementers.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Malabika. And I think you really captured the essence of the answer around defining global health more inclusively, not creating a big tent. That is to say, global health encompasses settings both in resource-poor settings all over the world, not necessarily in high income or low and medium income, and to use words that we can all rally around in expressing equity. And I'm going to turn to David now. The same question, but I'm going to vary it a little bit. Given your call to action, you really gave some specific call to action in what we should do as academics and as partners, even in the room. What kind of messaging how should we message health inequity or health equity in a way that we are able to have that big tent that Malabika is referring to, where people come around together to kind of band together to solve some of these health inequities problems?
Thanks. It's hard to follow Malabika's answer, to be honest. But I think there are many ways of looking at how we can have that inclusive voice. And partly it's recognition that although we're trying to have convergence and a coherent message, it doesn't mean that we don't embrace the diversity of those messages, because it's those multiple voices that make the better whole. So since you asked from an academic perspective, academics are great at disagreeing with each other and at finding different ways of looking at it. So even if you look at say, the concept of equity, if you want to look at, whether you believe that it's really the distributional pathway of, looking at equity of who benefits and who's harmed, and, the difference principles, or whether you're interested in procedural justice, there's different ways. We actually gain by looking at those different points of view, but some of them are threatening, and so, for example, some of the, what you might call the recognitional pathway, where, people of different cultures or identities are, and generally have been not accepted or marginalized, and when you create a different space for them, that can be threatening to others. And I think we are seeing some of that. And even the equity principle in terms of who gains and who loses, that can often be perceived as winners and losers, and often it is an issue of creating winners and losers. So, I think that part of this is, I would say, we gain by actually having the full discussion around things around which we agree. We don't have to agree on the same chance. It's fine when we do talk with one voice, but many voices. And I would just say that some of the most difficult aspects of equity are not looking at, well, it's hard to be egalitarian, but if you are actually trying to pursue, say, corrective justice, and trying to hold those accountable, those that hold those who are accountable for actions responsible, that becomes a whole different line of thinking. And we're seeing a different kind of retributive justice in this country. But I think we need to be able to, and academics can come together around those greater principles of what we're looking for in I would say, a multitude of voices, and being more engaged with those that are giving thought outside of the academic institution itself.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's a very comprehensive answer. And I think we're going to be shifting gears a little bit more into implementation research now, and really to begin to think about principles and some of the broad approaches for using implementation research to address these inequities and to actually strengthen our opportunities to achieve the aspirations of global health. So I'm going to turn to Yodi. And I think you did mention some of this in your presentation, but I would really love you to elaborate some more on some of those specific implementation research principles and strategies that can be used to address health inequities, more specifically in global health setting, particularly around global health programs. And to the extent that you can speak to different actors, academics, practitioners, policymakers, and so on, please do so.
Okay. So there are a lot of principles around IR, but I would just mention four. First, contextualization, and then systematic, multidisciplinarity, and then complex. So first, contextualizations. In every IR, context is important. So with that, when we do IR, we need to recognize the power dynamic. We need to reflect on colonial legacies, asymmetries in funding, expertise, decision-making, and addressing all of this require intentional collaboration that respect local leadership. So, and also in terms of contextualization, that means you need to engage the communities from the outset, involving the frontline workers, patients, civil society early in the research process, so that you actually co-define the priorities, ensuring that your implementation, your program is aligned with actual community needs. So that's one, contextualization. Second one is systematic, meaning that you should systematically co-create and also strengthen capacity. So that means you build your interventions together with the local stakeholders. You ensure there's capacity building, you ensure there's infrastructure, resource support, and resource sharing, which all will foster local ownership and sustainability. Third, multidisciplinarity. That means that you bridge a diverse field, you engage practitioners, you engage social scientists, economists, policy experts, community leaders, that you can actually capture the full scope of challenges and solutions. And last, complex. That means we need to embrace systems thinking, so that because health inequities often stems from interwoven social, economic, and political factors. So we need to tackle these multi-level complexities by analyzing feedback loops, system constraint, and downstream effects of such intervention. So having these four principles in place, we make sure that the implementation not only succeed technically, but also meaningfully advance equity.
And the same question to Malabika, but varied a little bit. Are there specific strategies, implementation strategies that actually tackles health inequities? And I think you did mention some of them in your presentation, but you might want to speak a little bit more to how they are varied from one context to another context.
But I think it's more passive, not active. It's because, as my colleague, Archana Shrestha another implementation researcher from Nepal, she mentioned one of the panel that still now, if you look at the framework, they're not equity-driven framework implementation research. And most of this framework is developed in the high-income country or northern countries. They are not contextualized within the country. So I'll be hesitant to say that implementation research really kind of ensure the equity, but it's definitely there a scope to make it more inclusive, but we need to work more to make those framework or methodology very much context-specific and also equity-driven.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And I think we're moving towards the end of this segment of the discussion. I'm going to turn to David to have the last word. Thanks. To have the last word in this segment and really to reflect on the role of implementation research for advancing equity, particularly call to action to different actors that plays a role in implementation research.
Okay, well, I'll try and answer at least part of that question. But, I think the principle about implementation research being fit for purpose is really critical. And part of that we're becoming more familiar with is trying to understand the problem and the right research method, and typically multiple methods. But I think fit for purpose also needs to look at, whose problem, whose issues are we addressing, what are the impact in terms of those distributions of who's benefiting and who's being harmed, and then who's engaged in the various parts of implementation research. But I would also suggest that we need to know the limitations of research as in terms of solving problems, and implementation is all about solving problems. And that part of this is that we need to look for multiple sources of evidence, and they're not all research-based in the traditional ways of thinking of it. There are other ways of getting information from communities, from organizations, from those with experience and tacit knowledge that are really pertinent. And yes, you can apply research methods to them, and it seems like every gathering we can gather information and create a research project, as we're doing now with the cards. But I think that it is about being fit for purpose, and particularly thinking and framing it in an equity lens. And with that, you want the kind of evidence that you are generating with engagement to really get at those issues of, is it trustworthy? Trustworthy to whom? How do you judge trustworthiness, particularly in the face of misinformation? Is it sufficient? And sufficient is, does the information address enough of the problem? But is also not sufficient if you haven't considered the voice of those that are marginalized, those that are intended beneficiaries. And of course, that's also, related to its relevance. So I think that that taking that principle of fit for purpose and really putting it into an equity lens is at least a principled approach to addressing the role of implementation research and moving towards equitable outcomes, better outcomes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Please, can we give a round of applause to our panelists today? Yes, so we're going to hear from the audience, and first I really want to appreciate everyone. There are tens and tens of cards that have been completed. So we might not get a chance to read all of the questions, but Dr. Elova has carefully curated some of the questions to give us a diversity of voice. And I would, for those who have put their name, I would invite you, if you want to clarify your question. If I didn't read it correctly, you can come to the microphone. And the first question is from Kavita Lalatambi. She's from Women Lift Health, and the question, which I'm going to address to Malabika, is how do universities use evidence from implementation research to fight the current attacks on knowledge and the intellectual class, while at the same time not being viewed as elitist or left-wing fanatics? That is, how do implementation researchers or practitioners do the dance, to be apolitical and yet make an impact? So I don't know, Kavita, if I got your question right, or if you want to make any clarification.
Very difficult question.
Yes.
It's really difficult.
Yeah, no, that's
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. So, Malabika.
Okay, so as one of the very few Brown faculty from Brown School of Public Health, because Brown is not brown, believe me. They have just started brownizing the Brown. I'll say that it's like the only way we academics, and my current experience as an academic, we're using as a case studies in our classroom, the evidence from the implementation research. But that's why I want to focus, again, going back to that other indicators, that for communication, that's this information of the implementation research, how do you communicate with the Minister of Health or implementers who will not make decision. I think the Viraj said that day that based on what the published. And it's true, it's very unfortunate that we leftists, sorry, I consider me as a leftist, whether I have to be guillotine or not, but it's very unfortunate the people whom we are fight for and compassionate and empathetic, they are against us. I think that's the most unfortunate reality in this world. That's that's a curse to be leftist or elitist. I have problem, but the leftist I don't have any problem. But to tell you answer, because we need to more communicate, and we fail to communicate, even as a leftist, I would say, that to communicate with the general population. So our communication, the language, again, focusing on the cultural and lingual sensitivity and going closer to that population is very important. And that's we should try to teach our students. I think that's very important.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Malabika. I don't know if David or Yodi have anything to add to that. Yes, Yodi?
Okay, thank you. I just want to highlight that when it comes to implementation research, it should not be driven by universities. I mean, ideally, when it comes to implementation research, it's embedded in the health program. So it should not be a question from the university side, because the ideal implementation research is embedded, is integrated, is institutionalized within the health programs. And that's what we've been trying to do in practice at the moment. In Indonesia, for example, the Ministry of Health is doing it. They're funding it. It's not relying on external funding because they see the advantage, the benefits of IR. So not to have this IR to be driven from universities, as it was implied in the question.
Yeah, thanks a lot. David?
I think I won't say it as well as my colleagues. So you can bring in the next question.
Okay, and then the next question is actually for you.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't know, I'm going to read the question. There's no name on it or affiliation, but if the person wants to clarify, please, you're welcome to come to the microphone. And the question is around how slow implementation science is. The implementation science research is often too slow, too overwrought and not relevant to the speed and reality of fast-moving global health programs. And I will add to that decision-making. People want to make decisions quickly. And implementation research takes, forever. How can it be done faster to impact global health programs in real time? So I don't know if I got the questions correctly. Yes. Do you want to clarify? Mike, okay, good. Yeah. So David, over to you.
Right, thanks. So, yes, we'd like to do it in real time, and maybe if we have an AI-assisted scientist, we could do more. But I think that it really is about the context in which you want to, with the nature of the problem that you're addressing. So I think that often, we do a lot of research that is really over-designed for the purpose in which it's intended. So, timeliness is a big part of what makes something useful. And different kinds of questions need to be answered in a rapid way and almost a continuous learning way. And there are ways of doing that, whether it's rapid learning cycles or if you look at evidence-based management, they have this, ask, acquire, assess and aggregate methods of how do you rapidly look at evidence. But not all questions need to be answered rapidly. You need good enough evidence, making, I would say, the best use of available evidence of different kinds of research. It doesn't mean it's more, rigorous. I think we have some false expectations that everything leads to a p-value of less than 0.05, and life doesn't work, and that we're only going to make decisions based on 95% confidence. But I am paraphrasing, so the statisticians, please ignore me for what I just said. But we do need, but it is a question of that fit-for-purpose method for the problem. And we do have, methods that you can, that are available in terms of rapid learning that are appropriate for those kinds of questions. But the question, the follow-up of that is when you have rapid learning for a quick answer, you also need then to have continuous adaptation. So you need structures that put in those kind of continued learning, because we have a lot of interest in trying to have a fixed answer for things, and yet the answer many times is about how do we adapt, how do we change and anticipate change. And so increasingly we're seeing much more sophisticated methods to do that, but often it's about using the most intuitive often, but using best available evidence with research that is good enough for the problem to answer it.
Thanks.
Can I answer quickly? Because 8 years I have done implementation research in Bangladesh. All we have done within 2 to 3 months, because it was the implementer who approached us, was the government, UNICEF, the BRAC, or the foundation. So just to tell you that not always that it takes longer time, but when it is implementers generated based on the routine data, it's much quicker.
Yeah,
Can I add to that also?
Yes, Yuri.
So also to highlight that implementation research should not be a panacea. I mean, it's not for everything. It doesn't answer every single questions. I mean, it does answer a lot of important questions, but for some very imminent policy question, it might not be IR. Could be other methods. You have rapid synthesis, rapid systematic review. There are so many other methods which are perhaps more appropriate to actually answer policy questions. So IR is powerful. It's part of the portfolio that we have, but it's not for every single policy question.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So to summarize, yes, there are methods, as David has said, there are rapid methods that implementation research offers us, but fundamentally, those methods should be fit for purpose, and not all things should be done quickly. Some need some time and thought. And one way to short-circuit it is what some of the things Malabika have said, to involve the question, the owner of the question from the get-go. And that would provide pathways for you to figure out how to learn and to continue to learn. And again, Yodi has emphasized that not all things are answerable through higher specification and method. So we're going to move on because we want to get through as many cards as possible. This question is from Madeleine Nijaras from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And this question is going to Yodi. And she's asking specifically to you, Yodi. Would you describe a time, you alluded to that during your presentation. Would you describe a time you overlooked equity concerns and what you changed about your approach moving forward to not make the same mistake again as you were conducting your implementation research?
Yeah, okay, thank you. So
sorry, Madeleine, I don't know if you're still in the room. If you want to, do you want to clarify or add anything to your question? Okay, no. Oh yes, she's coming.
Yes, sorry, I meant similar to how Yodi had mentioned in his talk, the example from Indonesia. So if either of the other panelists want to answer as well.
Okay, so I will ask Yodi to elaborate, and then we'll ask both David and Malabika to weigh in. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so I've already alluded in the presentation, but just again to say what we will take up from this is, as I mentioned, is to rethink the way that we've been training IR, because yes, at the moment it's very technical. We don't actually talk much about equity in the IR, so having that lessons, we need to rethink that, okay, in our IR training, we should equity at the center so that it's not in the backseat anymore when we do IR.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that there's probably more examples where we've tried to pursue equity and not move the needle, and I can think even or move the needle in unexpected ways, and I can think of times in Afghanistan in a previous regime there where we were looking at trying to improve equity through different approaches, and the notion being that if you just monitor, measure, and disclose, and then hold accountable and problem solve around it, that would solve it. And it doesn't always work. And then sometimes you are, I think that, sorry, that's another thought, but I think that we've found, for instance, that we didn't maybe we had the program that was intended to improve access, and it certainly did, and it may have improved access more for the near poor than for maybe the most poorest of the poor. And so you don't always achieve those things. And then we've turned to other type of unintended consequences where, for this whole group of times that, we worked in Afghanistan, we probably had 350 people working there, for Afghans working in it. When the regime changed, all of a sudden, because they had worked with us, they now had targets and many of them refugees, and they can't always, and trying to basically become just to survive under the next regime. So you do things that you do things together with the intention of trying to improve equity, and yet there are real harms that can come as a result of that, and not always anticipated.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. Yes, let's move on. And then this next question is going to be around equity, really. It's going to be questions around equity, so I'm going to take a bunch of them together. Atusha Bonyani from UCSF is asking, how should we define equity in resource limited setting? And related to that is another question, which is specifically in low and middle income country setting, how can we promote IR to address equity issues? So if you could just take those two together, Malabika.
So equity is what is fair and inclusive and sustainable. I think that's the way to define it, which is it's easy to understand. And the way IR addresses equity, I would say that because I'm privileged to be in Bangladesh as a Bangladeshi, because their government and non-government work together, and all of you know about Grameen Bank or BRAC or a different organization. So when we work with organization or government, looking at even the routine data, you can identify that who are deprived. And most of those NGOs in Bangladesh, particularly focusing on the ultra-poor or vulnerable population. So I do think that it's very important to look at the routine data, talking to the frontline worker who knows it all, that who are in the village are deprived or not, talking to the policymakers. So that will be like a dialogue-based, and that's the way we can ensure that who are those vulnerable population who are not receiving the services or deprived of. So I would say that approach needs to be the database, evidence-based, but also in a discussion with those who are the implementers.
Yeah, so drive it with data, but also engagement and the community.
That's in the community. The community health worker, quickly, one example, I would say that BRAC had a huge problem with the pediatric TB identification. It was only 3%, not 10%. And they were looking at the data, and the director came to me. I said, let's talk with the Shastro Shebika, our community health worker, why the pediatric TB diagnosis is so low. And we had a series of focus group discussion, and we found out, they said that we give BCG. Bangladesh, 90% cover is BCG, so children can't have a tuberculosis. So it was a very quick and clean, not dirty, research we did within few weeks, and we understood that that's the vulnerability from the frontline health worker. They have this belief that because of BCG, no child can have TB. So that you can't find it. It's not about the lack of knowledge of the population. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks. I don't know if David or Yodi wants to weigh in.
Sure, but recognizing that although I've spent most of my career in low-income settings, I'm not from there, so this is an outsider's perspective. But you see in every society, you see unfairness. So equity, and issues of inequity are found everywhere, and so as well as discrimination and marginalization. So there are common methods and approaches to use to be addressing those, and many of them are about building from the strengths of the communities to try to bridge those gaps. And sometimes outsiders can have that role of being able to not just point out where the issues are, but using these types of methods to engage and to bring, even if it's about bringing, say, health workers and their intended beneficiaries together, that you use the role as an outsider to be able to contribute to those using methods and building on the strengths, and then get out of the way as much as you can. But there's no country, there's no place that doesn't have issues with unfairness and inequity that can't and shouldn't be neglected.
It's a pervasive problem, so we all have to have the answers. Jody?
Yeah, I mean, similar for me also, equity is about fairness. I mean, to elaborate, I mean, it's basically ensuring that everyone has a fair chance to reach their highest possible level of health. But also to realize that to do that, it requires quite a collaborative, quite hard effort to actively dismantle structural imbalances across all stages of global health work, be it at local, national, global health level. And implementation research does have contribution to that. And the second question is how to do that in the IR. And I alluded to in the previous question also that to do that, we need to institutionalize, to embed IR in low and middle income countries among the ministries of health, among the health programs, to embed equity-focused IR in these settings.
Yeah, thank you. And on that, just before we go to the last set of cards, there is a question from Alex Ernst from UCSF, and I think it's related to what we're discussing about equity, how to define it in low-resource countries and settings. And the question is, how do we continue to center diverse voices on equity when certain populations have been erased and excluded by government? So we all described some strategies to discuss equity and to bring people together, but how do you do that when some of the people that should be at the table are being erased within this society? And any one of our panelists could start it off.
So I think that's exactly the space when academics and civil society, whether it be business or NGOs, need to step in. And that's where, showing that solidarity, trying to demonstrate the evidence that often it is to the betterment of everyone if you address the issues of those that are most discriminated against. And so this is exactly the space where academics and civil society should step in, was when government fails to do so.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that mainstreaming equity in our education, one does not have the equity analyst or how to do the regression to know that who are the vulnerable population and have a special equity class. I think if in our public health education, we can integrate, even the medical education, we can integrate equity as a subject through the equity lens to understand what the vulnerable population is. Not a rocket science. So that's the way I think that we can create I would say that knowledge sovereignty, that all of us will be sensitive and aware about the equity. So mainstreaming equity in public health education.
Okay, mainstreaming equity in every conversation and in engagements. Mm-hmm. So we'll move on to the last set of cards, and this is really focusing more on researchers and academics. And it's acknowledging our role in where we are today, how we got to this place where we are right now, what global health is. There's a question, there's no name on it, but it's how can we, researchers, admit our own impact and shortcomings with public mistrust? We talked about misinformation, and this question is saying that we contributed to some of those misinformation and to the mistrust from the public. How can we see the new funding changes, that is stoppages and funding cuts, as a sign that we have excluded the public to a point where they don't trust our intentions? I think, Jody, you're going to kick this off.
Oh. I was hoping I'm the last. Okay. So yes, I mean, that's partly, in many large parts, also our fault, I mean, as academicians, of not being able to communicate well. That also breeds a lot of distrust, but also it also shows our lack of engagement with the community, because this distrust doesn't happen overnight. I mean, it happens because we lack engagement with the community for many, many years, perhaps. I mean, it takes time to build trust. If it ever happens of a distrust, then it falls back to us what have we been doing for these past years. We have not been doing enough to actually gaining the trust of the community. That it doesn't disappear overnight. I mean, it's something which accumulates and happens because we have not engaged enough the community. We don't have enough skill to actually engage the community effectively to build that trust.
Yeah, thank you. And I think Victoria Short had asked a related question from the University of Georgia. She's asking more specifically to health disinformation. How can we address health disinformation at the local level without further endangering burdening community health workers? So she's really zeroing in on community workers because we think they have a role to play in community engagement and in linking community to the health services delivery system. So how do you address health disinformation at the local level, and I'm coming to David, at the local level without further burdening community health workers? I would love David to kick it off and then Malabika to comment.
Okay, so, I think how do we build back trust, and particularly at the local level, I think it's always a big challenge how to do that. And I think part of it is about, admitting where we have made mistakes, but also part of it is about continuing to call to evidence that comes from reliable sources, but in ways in which the information is gathered that is transparent and that can show that conclusions are logical. But, that's only that's a very rational approach. We also have to ensure that have communications that get out to people, that appeal to the narratives of their and realities of their daily lives. And that's where people that are front lines and working with, with patients, clients, those are the ones that really need to be equipped with it, with those tools. And then there's also the importance of just our own ethical behavior and being able to demonstrate ethical behavior and calling out when things are discriminatory, when claims are not based in evidence. And yes, it will feel like whack-a-mole on the ladder, but I think that needs to be sort of the all-hands-on-deck type of approach to those issues of being able to build back trust.
The question is that, do we invest in trust? Building trust? No, we don't. So when you talk about the decolonization, to me, decolonization is like patriarchy. It's a concept. A mother-in-law can be as patriarchal as possible. So decolonization is not only the white people in the north. We have to decolonize ourselves within Bangladesh from the frontline health worker or those who are implementers. So starting with that, I do think that there have to be, that's why I think that the journal or donor agency should, or even like in university when you do the research, to make it mandatory, we have to communicate our research result at the community level with our beneficiaries, with our community health worker, with our primary health worker, rather than a dissemination workshop in a 5-star hotel in the capital with the Ministry of Health and development partners. Because if we build the trust, they will kind of accept whatever the information we are sharing. If we don't have the trust, it doesn't matter. So we have to invest in building start, and decolonization have to start in the southern country first, then to move to the northern countries. So
there are power differentials even within low and middle income country setting, for sure. Not just focusing on high income to low and middle income countries. And we have to bridge those differentials to build trust. Excellent. Let's now go to the last question, which I think we've talked about, we've danced around this a little bit, but we really didn't give a specific call to action, which is really to the private sector, right? So this is from a colleague from ABH Partners, and the question is, how can the private sector both locally and globally, help in implementation research, specifically implementation research for addressing inequities. So how can the private sector, both locally within countries and globally, help in IR for equity? I think Malabika should start. Okay.
So again, we have to actively engage in private sector. In Bangladesh, 97% of the people, they go to private sector. They don't go to the public sector. Even for a season section which costs $1,000, whereas there is like a $5 in public sector. So we need to build that partnership because this commercialization health is killing us. So rather than having negative attitude towards pharmaceutical company or big private hospital, we need to kind of extend our hand and approach them and start a dialogue and conversation.
So we need to bring in the private sector into the conversation, yet bigger tent. Yodi.
Yes, similar, but also to recognize that the private sector is a big umbrella. I mean, there are private for profit, private not for profit. And so all of that entities are out there. They have different interests, they have different missions, but as Malabika said, we need to bring them together under the tent and have a dialogue with them and to manage the interest. I mean, whether you like it or not, in many low middle income countries like Bangladesh, like Indonesia, it's a huge part of the health system.
To manage their interests. So what do you do when their mission and their vision does not align with your interests? Where their incentives, I mean, they're looking for profit and you're looking to do a goodwill. I will ask David to start this off, then we'll come back to
Sure. So, I mean, I think as Yodu pointed out, there are a diversity of actors in the private sector. And yeah, I think you look for common values and common goals in terms of those types of collaborations that you need, because there's much greater scope for innovation and flexibility, responsiveness in the private sector. But not all private sector is the same, whether it be many large multinational corporations that really control markets, and some of them are quite unhealthy. I can't think of a useful collaboration with the tobacco industry, for example. But so I think that you need to be able to identify where those conflicts are, and be able to not just manage them, but there will be places where no. But the private sector is so huge, and that the problem is if you don't engage on producing, evidence and working towards those common values and goals, we'll be missing out a lot. And that's so it is. It is a huge area for growth, and we need to learn how to do it better. Academia has not always done well with that, but also there's a lot going on in the innovation space with social entrepreneurship and all kinds of private sector enterprise that I think is really quite healthy in many respects.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I think private sector as determinants of health, private sector as service provider of health, and there are different incentives for engagements. So we really are coming to the end of our session, and we have about 4 more minutes, and I would like each of our panelists to have maybe there are burning comments that you've not had the opportunity to make in the course of the discussion and the conversation. 1 minute, please, for your reflection. Closing remarks. Yudi, please.
Okay. No burning comment. Just to re-highlight again that for me, equity is not just an aspiration, but a necessity. But to be able to deliver that, we do need to reconfigure the global health architecture, and implementation research does have a lot of potentials to contribute, but we need to rethink the way that we deliver IR capacity building, and we perhaps even need to reinvent IR as a field to be able to contribute to equity.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Malabika.
I strongly believe, I'm an optimist, this global crisis will push for power shift and will ensure the global equity.
Thank you. David.
So, not burning, but I think, this topic of implementation research is one that provides huge opportunity for leveraging and in many ways to improve health and equity. But I think that our actions need to be grounded in seeking justice and engaged with each other in societies, and really following those kind of principles to achieve that. Now, I was prompted by another comment from the audience that I think is important, that we currently have 10 provinces and 3 territories, and if you want to have another province or territory in the US, you are more than welcome.
Wow, thank you so much. On that note, I really want us to give a round of applause to our panelists. So let fairness and justice be our North Star, okay? Implementation research can help in different contexts to achieve that. Thank you very much.
Excellent.